Hello, this is Mrs. Grosch, and the topic for today's lecture is rock classification. If you had a pile of rocks like the one you see on the screen, well, you could sort it in a number of ways. But the way that scientists classify rocks is according to how they form. There's three basic groups of rocks: igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks. They all form in different ways. The first kind of rock that I'll talk about are igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are often thought of as volcano rocks, and it is true that some of them form as a result of a volcanic eruption. Igneous rocks are made when molten minerals cool down and turn from a liquid to a solid. You probably already know that when a volcano erupts, there's some very hot material that comes out. The melted rock material that comes out of a volcano is called lava. And the lava, when it cools off, it actually cools off pretty quickly because it's exposed to the air. And it forms a type of igneous rock that we call extrusive because it forms outside of the volcano above the Earth's surface. These kinds of rocks form relatively quickly, and that gives them a certain characteristic. What you might not realize is that sometimes material from the volcano never actually gets out of the ground. We give it a different name. When it doesn't come out of the ground, we call the material magma. And when it cools off without ever coming out from under the ground, it cools off much more slowly. It's still considered an igneous rock, but because it is cooling off more slowly and under the ground, we give it a different name. We call it an intrusive igneous rock, and it looks different from the extrusive igneous rocks. The way that an igneous rock cools will give it different characteristics, and we have special words to describe the texture of these different kinds of igneous rocks. Each rock texture gives you clues about how the rock cooled off after it formed. The first kind of igneous rock texture is called phaneretic. Phaneretic rocks have large crystals, and that's because they cooled off very slowly. So these are generally intrusive igneous rocks. They cool off slowly under the ground. Another kind of igneous rock has crystals, but they're hard to see because they're very tiny. You would really need to use at least a magnifying glass, maybe even a microscope, to see the crystals. They're called aphanetic, and they form above the Earth's surface because they cool off very quickly. The next texture is really interesting. These kinds of rocks really have no apparent crystals at all. Even with a magnifying glass or a microscope, you wouldn't see individual crystals. That's because they cool off so fast. These kinds of rocks are called glassy rocks. Sometimes when volcanoes erupt, they erupt so violently that gases form and get stuck in the lava. And then when that lava cools off, if it cools off very fast, for example, if it goes into the ocean, it can actually form a rock that has little air holes. This kind of rock is called a vesicular rock. Vesicular rocks are formed when the lava mixes with gases from the volcano and cools really quickly before those gases have a chance to go into the air. Generally speaking, the bigger the crystals in a rock, the slower it cooled off. Another way that we can describe igneous rocks is based on their color. Some igneous rocks are very light in color. We call them felsic. They're light in color because they're made of light color minerals, feldspar and quartz. On the other hand, some igneous rocks are very dark in color. We call those mafic, and they're dark in color because they have some metals, magnesium and iron, in them, and those are both very dark color metals. So you can see that just looking at an igneous rock, you can get all kinds of clues about what materials it's made from and whether it cooled off above ground or below ground. Sedimentary rocks are formed very differently from igneous rocks. They form above the Earth's surface. What happens is Rocks that are already on the surface of the earth can get worn down by the environment. They might get worn down by moving water or wind, or maybe even animals or humans breaking up the rock. Over time, those little pieces of rock that get broken down, well, they can layer up. This often happens underwater. And over a period of time, they can get cemented together by the pressure of other layers over the top of them and by dissolved minerals that are in the water. And they can form a solid rock we call a sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rocks look very different from igneous rocks. They're usually light in color, and they usually don't have very shiny crystals, so they're pretty dull. Because they form under the water most of the time, they form in layers, and sometimes you can even see those layers if you have a big sedimentary rock formation. If you have a fossil in a rock, it's almost definitely a sedimentary rock because igneous rocks just form in much too hot an environment for fossils to stay around. The same for the third kind of rock, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So sedimentary rocks may have fossils. Other kinds of rocks almost never do. There are some ways that we describe the texture of sedimentary rocks. One thing that we look for is whether or not they have pebbles or little rock fragments. If they do, we call those rocks clastic rocks. And those clastic rocks might be coarse-grained, meaning that they have very large rock particles in them, or they could be fine-grained, meaning that the particles are so small they're almost like grains of sand. Some sedimentary rocks contain the remains of plants or animals that are combined and held together with minerals. These are called organic sedimentary rocks. Some things you might notice about them: you might actually see shell fragments that make up the rock, or if you see fossils, that's a good way to tell that you have an organic sedimentary rock. A third type of rock are metamorphic rocks. Metamorphosis is a word that means change, and metamorphic rocks are rocks that started out as a different type of rock, but then, because they were pushed underground, they were exposed to high heat and pressure, and that can make them change into something new, a metamorphic rock. There are two things that can make metamorphic rocks form. One is heat, and this kind of metamorphism is called contact metamorphism. These are rocks that get baked. They're exposed to heat, but not enough heat to melt and form magma. But they might have magma near them, and it's so hot that it bakes the rocks, and this changes their form. Another thing that can happen to rocks when they're underground is that they can be squeezed. There's lots of forces in the Earth's crust, which we'll learn about later in the year. And those forces can squeeze rock and push it around, and that can actually make it change into a new kind of rock called a metamorphic rock. Both of these things happen under the Earth's surface, so metamorphic rocks really form underground. Some characteristics of metamorphic rock is, because they've been squeezed and baked, they're generally very dense and very hard, more so than the other types of rock. They often have mineral crystals, but if they do, they might be flattened or even fused together because of the pressure and the heat that they've been exposed to. There are two words that we use to describe the texture of metamorphic rocks. Some metamorphic rocks are foliated. That means that the crystals that were in the rock got flattened and lined up. Some ways that you can tell that you have a foliated metamorphic rock is to look for stripes or bands or even just signs that they break in sheets. Of course, some metamorphic rocks are made from just one kind of mineral, which means you wouldn't see stripes or bands of color. These kinds of rocks are called non-foliated. And just because they don't have stripes doesn't mean they're not made of crystals, but they're usually made of one type of crystal. So you might see the crystals look fused together. You don't see individual specks and pieces. They all look like they're joined, and these rocks tend to be very, very hard. Well, this has been some of the main things that you should know about the three types of rock, how they form, and how we describe their characteristics. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in class tomorrow.